Hi, welcome back to FamSociology. Now we're going to look at, I know, it's not the most fun subject matter, but it's coming apart or divorce. Just so you know, divorce is one of the most common deviations from the traditional family cycle. So for instance, children are now more likely than any other generation in the past to have parents who live in separate households. Many of you will have experienced divorce either in your own nuclear family or through some other relative or friend. This chapter examines the social factors that help explain why some couples divorce. We will then look at the process of a divorce, which includes planning the breakup, the separation, and the reorganization of the family or the formation of a new families. Now, this process can produce psychological and practical crises. An increasing number of children live through the dissolution of a parent's marriage. This experience has a variety of repercussions for their development. And this chapter also covers the important issues of custody, child support, and post-divorce parenting arrangements. So let's get started with the history and the current state of divorce in Canada. Now, divorce is the legal dissolution of a marriage. And divorce is one of the most common, as I mentioned in the introduction, common deviations from the traditional life cycle. Divorced families tend to add between 2 and 3 phases to the family life cycle. Separation, well, that's a perhaps, unless you've lost a partner due to death. Then a remarriage could be another. And thirdly, stabilization into the new family pattern. So divorce is not uniform. It's not the same for everybody, and it should not be oversimplified. In practice, the divorce experience is quite diverse for couples and their families. So let's consider the history of divorce in Canada. Now, it may not be as you've expected. Divorce has not always been common. In the early Canada years, laws for divorce were strict, and divorce was very infrequent. The church dominated social life and forbade divorce. 1840 to 1968, the federal parliament had exclusive authority over divorce. Men needed to prove adultery by their wife. Women needed to prove desertion, which was defined by 2 years or longer, known as the poor man's divorce. Men would just walk away. Or, if not through that 2-year period, extreme mental or physical cruelty. Come Confederation, anyone living in a province without a divorce court could submit a private member's bill to Parliament. If it passed, divorce was granted. It was a long process, and it was an expensive process. 1925 and on, women could get a divorce based on proof of adultery only. Now, it's also important to note that in around that 1926, I believe it was, women had gained the right to vote. So a lot of changes were starting to occur for women at this early point in time in Canadian history. Immediately after World War II, the divorce rate jumped, resulting from either freedom and financial independence of women experienced in the workforce while men were at war, hasty wartime marriages, and prolonged separations. With the relaxing of the church's position on divorce, divorce is beginning to be seen as an acceptable solution to marriage breakdown. Now, this is important here, too, because we didn't have a Divorce Act for many years, so there were changes to the Divorce Act, divorce law in 1968, where it introduced no-fault principle while maintaining some degree of fault based on either adultery or cruelty, and it was available to both men and women. In 1985, another adjustment to the Divorce Act occurred where it reduced the waiting periods for granting divorces after 1 year of marriage breakdown. It resulted in an enormous increase in the number of divorces, both in 68 and in 85. Now, there's another term we should refer to. It's called the divorce rate. Now, this is a measure that predicts the proportion of couples that can be expected to divorce before their 30th wedding anniversary, and it's based on the patterns of divorce and current patterns of divorce. So why people divorce? Well, let's check with our sociological perspectives. We can consider why people divorce by getting their perspective or stating reasons, or we can consider the social causes that may underlie these stated reasons. And I should hearken back to week 1 when we looked at the sociological imagination. Look at the difference between personal issues and those that are affected by public issues. A study of Canadian attitudes to divorce found 3 kinds of reasons for divorce. The first is what's known as fundamental issues. These were things like infidelity and abuse. They're basic, fundamental. Secondly was experiential issues, where things like disagreements and an unsatisfactory sex life could be a part of that. And then the third grouping for reasons was fertility issues like infertility and the desire to have children. Ethnic groups and religious denominations handle divorce, the how, the who, and the when, from their own groups. There are social factors that increase the likelihood of divorce, like the following that I'll mention here. For example, those who marry before the age of 20 are much more likely to separate. Lower socioeconomic status is related to higher divorce rates. Cohabitation before marriage increases the likelihood of divorce. And spouses whose parents have divorced are more likely to divorce themselves. So we'll look at a few of these sociological perspectives about how we might explain divorce. And we'll start, as we often do, with structural functionalism. As mentioned, the function or the structure of society includes family as one of those structures. So family structure is preferred to be men that provide the economic support and women the emotional support and the personal care. Culturally, now marriages and divorce is changing. These changes affect the ease of getting a divorce and the stigma associated with divorce. The feminists, they address the unequal power distribution in family between husbands and wives. As women have become more independent, getting post-secondary education and their own careers, they may have more opportunities and more freedom from abuse and oppression. The symbolic interactionalists, well, they consider that the way that the couple interacts with one another, their expectations about the marriage, and how to pursue your individual goals in a relationship, much emphasis looks at how each participant, the husband, the wife, and their children or their child, deal with and communicate about their transition, about the divorce. Now, the developmental theorists, they're depending upon when the couple divorces, like what stage does the divorce occur in. Perhaps it's easier when the divorce happens earlier without children. Divorce gets more difficult when there's children, traditions, and extended family are established. Now, something that's really important to discuss when we look at divorce is that there is such a thing as what's called the divorce or the road to divorce. Divorces are not usually a surprise or sudden. Decisions to divorce does not usually occur in a single phase. There are new boundaries, stress is high, many changes in emotions. We're going to consider how do families proceed to and through divorces. Well, the first thing that comes to mind when we think about the first step, the first stage, is the decision. One or both recognize something's not okay with the marriage. Often this is known as this begins what's known as the divorce cascade. There's increased conflict. There's some serious considerations for divorce, maybe even a separation, and then ultimately, potentially a divorce. This cascade can increase the likelihood of a divorce as time or as the process goes on. People may delay separation until time they can consider more suitable. Like, for example, for women, they may want to find a job and go and get back to school, get that kind of set up, or couples may wait until the children leave home. Some minority groups emphasize family ties and responsibility above personal satisfaction. There are more older Canadians experiencing divorce in today's world, and this is what's known as the silver separation. Then the next stage for this plan, we've made the decision. Now, plan the breakup. Well, couples must plan the breakup of the family system. They need to work out cooperatively to settle issues such as custody, telling extended families, visitation, separation, finances. Planning process does not always run smoothly. Many couples separate and reconcile repeatedly. This introduces another term, boundary ambiguity. This is where the roles are changing in a more changing in a formal and involved way, and there are many uncertainties as to what roles one plays. Then the third step in this process is separation and family reorganization. Separation changes the relationship between husbands and wives. Couples with children need to decide how to coordinate responsibilities as co-parents. Much stress and uncertainty continues and can affect future relationships and life goals. Now, when you think of a divorce, you could put this in the frame of a crisis. So what we're going to touch on here is the crises of divorce. Divorce produces what is called a transitional state. It provides temporarily imbalance to routines and roles. We're going to break down into three new sort of crises. The first is emotional, the second is economic, and if there are children, then there's parenting. So let's start with the emotional crisis. Often couples will experience three aspects of an emotional crisis of a divorce. The first aspect is to accept or mourn the loss of the marriage. And that's important, because in order to move to the next relationship, if that's going to be coming, you have to first get past the first one. Secondly, deal with their identity issues, the who am I now that I'm in a separated or divorced relationship. And then thirdly, and it's equally important, is build a new social network. When these are accomplished successfully, growth and opportunity can result. During and after the separation process, individuals suffer the loss of important relationships. Often that relationship, that married relationship, has served as a center of people's lives, whether it's been satisfactory or not. So separation and divorce usually mean that individuals have to redefine themselves as people. With the growing number of divorced people, new social scripts are being developed. Relationships with extended family members change. We may have limited support from our own relatives with strong religious beliefs. We may even long for the connection of the ex-spouse's relatives who are no longer legally related to us. Most adapt by about 2 years post-divorce. Within 6 years, most have built a reasonably satisfying life to very satisfying life. See table 10.1. It's the patterns of adjustment to divorce, and there's 6 patterns there that are identified. You find them in your textbook. I think I put it in behind me here. Now let's touch base on the economics crisis. Divorce is considered to be the most expensive crisis. It usually means a drop in the standard of living, especially for the custodial parent, the one that has the children. The custodial parent is the parent with whom the children are living with most of their time. Both parents are responsible for the support of their children. They may be able to work things out with each other. However, in 1997, the federal government passed the Federal Child Support Guidelines. These guidelines focus on the cost of raising a child, the parent's income, and the number of children. You'll see on page 284 a review of these guidelines. It'll give you some idea. Now, in comparison to married, common law separations are split between federal and provincial governments, unlike the married couples. Indigenous people on reserves and immigrant families do follow a different path to separation in Canada. The third crisis is parenting crisis. When a family separates, new boundaries must be drawn. Old family rules and rituals no longer exist, and the new ones have not yet taken their place. Each parent needs to establish a relationship with their child or children separate from the other. If there's no clear understanding of new rules of the relationship, the child will likely become a victim of conflicts between parents. Divorcing parents may be unable to respond to their child's emotional need. So if we're touching on children, let's go into children and divorce. Divorce transforms a child's life forever. It affects where they live, how they interact with parents, if or how they continue relationships with friends. Few children want their parents to divorce, no matter how much tension there's been in the marriage. Children from divorced families are of a greater risk of developing problems than children in more stable two-parented families. Some additional sociological factors that affect some children and divorce include the age of the child. Very young children are less likely to be affected long-term by divorce if they receive good parenting. Secondly, divorce may affect boys and girls differently. Thirdly, the level of parental conflict pre- and post-separation impacts adjustment more than the absence of a parent, and that makes absolute sense. Next, the number and the degree of life changes, whether there's access to extended family members or not. Now, there is a term that enters in. It's called the sleeper effect, and this is a problem that emerges only after the child, or only after the effect of something like a divorce, where the child moves to young adulthood. There may be intimacy issues, and that's what they call the sleeper effect. We can also look at stressors and protective factors as an improved way to consider the impact of divorce on children is to look at what are known as stressors and protective factors. If we start looking at stressors, these include activities or situations that are stress-producing. They can include things like the separation itself, the quality of the parenting during and after divorce. Usually it tends to be poorer quality because the parent is dealing with their own emotional stuff as well. The loss of important relationship, friends and family, financial hardships, conflicts between parents before and after separation. Each of these have their own related components. Now you balance that with protective factors. Now these can include effective parenting by both parents, the social support of extended family, friends, and institutions. As you may have expected, those with predominantly stressors don't do as well as those with predominantly protective factors. You'll find more information of this in your textbook at 287 to 289. Now, as a result of a divorce and having children, custody becomes an issue, and so does parenting. So the next issue we'll look at is custody and parenting. The two terms point out here that will custody and access. We're going to touch base with custody. This term describes where children will live and who makes decisions about them, whereas access, this refers to the time the children spend with the parent that they do not live with. Now, to make sense of some of this, the Divorce Act is what is referred to when exploring parental arrangements or parenting arrangements. There are some issues to consider, like decisions regarding the children's education, health, and religion. Where are the children going to live? How much time will each parent spend with the children? How will the future issues be dealt with in the future? The current standard used is that the best interest of the child is paramount. Now, there are some other terms we can look at in relationship to custody and access, and one of them is known as the custodial parent-child relationship. The challenge of the custodial parent trying to restructure their lives, being emotionally and physically drained, often children are not able to get all they need, and it results in some issues that could be behavioral and attitude in nature. Whereas the non-resident parent-child relationship, well, most non-custodial parents are men. When the marriage is broken, men are sometimes at a loss as to how to manage the father-child relationship on their own. Higher education and income often result in more frequent contact and overall divorce experience. That is, of course, it's a relative. Education doesn't guarantee that. Now, if we're looking at custody, there are different types of custody. Let's look at these. Sole custody, here children live primarily with one parent. The other parent, often the dad, may or may not have rights to access. Sometimes it's referred to as the weekend dad. Then there's joint legal custody, where both parents have decision-making rights. It's the best when both parents can effectively work together with children's needs and at the foremost. Sole custody has been losing favor more recently, while growing interest is in shared custody. So let's look at shared custody. In this case, both parents are involved in the responsibility, care, and decision-making for children. This approach involves time spent with children to be more equal. A binuclear family is a family where there is a balance of time and responsibility between parents and their children, also spend equal time in each parent's home. A least used alternative in shared custody is what's known as bird nest arrangements. Now, here the children stay at a family home and each parent comes to the children when it's their turn. This has become more popular in the last 10 years. Now, there is something that's called split custody. Here, parents divide custody of their children. For example, the mother may claim the daughters and the husband claims the boys. So what kind of factors will determine custody? Well, for the most part, social norms and changes in legislation are influential in determining custody. Shared custody is most often the decision when parents have higher education and good income. Child support, there are guidelines that are set out by the federal child support guidelines to determine how much is to be paid. So if we're considering where might divorce be in the future, well, predictions are that in the future at least half of all marriages will dissolve. The implication? How to best ensure the healthy development of children living in divorced families. Children do tend to do best when they have continuity in their relationships and have regular contact with both parents and extended family. Children also need to be assured of adequate financial support. Achieving this demands serious commitment of both parents to the welfare of the children. It also requires an effective enforcement laws to back up those things. Children's best interests are served if parents receive adequate backup from extended families and from society as a whole. If left to do everything alone, the phenomena of single-parent burnout would continue to occur. Well, that's the end of the coming apart, the divorce experience. I hope this has been helpful. I hope it's been informative. And we'll see you next week in the next video. Bye now.